what I was asked to do was to share with you what I like and don't like about Vergers.
Wow.
And I've decided I'm not going to do it. What I am going to do for you, or with you, I hope, is to describe the kind of community I would hope that the Vergers would be. I just find the other way of doing it way too negative. I really don't like about Vergers. But I will just tell you one thing. I did the men's retreat for the Brotherhood of St. Andrews for the Saints Peter and Paul in Marietta. There were quite a few of them who were Vergers, and we were riding in the car, and I used a term that none of them had ever heard, and it's the only negative thing I have to say about being a Verger, and that's that Vergers should not be chancel prancers. And it's the perfect description of what you shouldn't be if you think about it. So I also want to take a minute to explain what I did in the liturgy. Having served as diocesan bishop, it's important, quite frankly, because all of us who are in holy orders, we have made a public vow to be obedient to the rubrics in that prayer book. And they say what they mean. And so, for instance, with the Creed, when it says Sunday or major feast, the definition of major feast is one of the prayer book festivals, not a lesser feast. And so the Creed is really inappropriate. And since I've taken the vow of obedience, and frankly, by extension, so have you as people who lead the liturgy, it's important that we do things the way they're designed to be done according to our tradition. Now, in other places, they do things differently, other parts of the community. That's not the point. The point is that this is our tradition, and we live and worship according to our tradition. And if nobody ever tells you that something is not proper, how are you supposed to know? And so, I mean, that's why I just stopped and said that. I mean, I decided, well, maybe we could just go ahead and say the Creed, but if I did that, then you'd never know that that's not appropriate. So I wasn't trying to embarrass anybody, but I do think we need to, one of the things, my hopes for the community of Vergers, is that you will find time to discover how it is that we as an American church have worshiped and what all of those little italic lines in the prayer book mean, called the rubrics. Because we're called to take them seriously as a community of people who lead worship. And so it's as important for you as it is for me. I mean, again, one of the things that everyone who's ever worked with me, both in the parish and in the diocese, will tell you that one of the things that drives me absolutely crazy are people who worship doing things that they don't know why they're doing them. They just do them because they saw them done. One of the things I would encourage the community of Vergers to do, again, because you are leaders, is to begin to discover why it is we do what we do and why we do it the way we do it. And there are all kinds of local variations. There's no two ways about it. And you don't need to get in an argument with your priest, even if your priest is wrong. This is the problem that poor deacons have. You know, they work for the priest, but they work for the bishop, and so they never quite know what they're supposed to say in that segment. But I want you to hear what I just said. I mean, functionally, what you do is you lead people in worship. You are a part of that group of people who provide an environment wherein persons can encounter God. The whole point of worship is to provide an environment where one can encounter the presence of God. And you are called to lead and guide people in that experience, to help provide that proper environment where that can take place. And you know, I've never been a verger, but I was as close as you can get to it liturgically. I was the canon for liturgy and worship at the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. If you know anything about the cathedral in Fond du Lac, it was one of the hotbeds of Anglo-Catholic revival in the American church. There's a famous picture from the cathedral in Fond du Lac, the consecration of the third bishop of the Diocese of Fond du Lac. And the reason it's a famous picture is it made the front page of the New York Times because all the bishops wore cope and mitre. This was in 1902 when that was a revolutionary thing to do in the Episcopal Church. Interestingly enough, one of the participants in that consecration was the great Tikhon, the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. And And let me tell you, if you want to see a bishop that looks grim, you should see him. And so, I mean, what we're talking about is complicated liturgy at its best. And because I was the canon for liturgy and worship, my job was to be master of ceremonies at all of the major services, including the ones where there were clergy present. I mean, you want to talk about trying to herd cats. About 40 or 50 clergy wandering around a cathedral at once, it gets to be very interesting, as Carl knows. I've noticed you're very gentle in a good way, in a firm way. So I know something of what it's like for you to lead people in a controlled way through the liturgy so that everyone else can have a wonderful experience. And one of the principal rules I learned from the dean at the time, as he was helping me learn my job, one of the things he said about being master of ceremonies at a major service is that if anybody remembers that you were there, you're not doing your job. Your job is not to draw attention to yourself, but to make sure that everyone else is where they need to be when they need to be there, and that things go smoothly, and that when things go wrong, you make it look just like it was supposed to happen that way. And I think that really fits part of what you are called to do. But one of the things I would say, I want to go back to Anthony of Egypt. One of the things I would hope that because you clearly are called to be leaders liturgically, that's reflective of your place in the life of the congregation. You see, I happen to think that what we do liturgically is simply a reflection of our own spirituality. And so my hope would be that if you're leaders in the liturgy, you're also leaders in the life of your congregation. If you are orderly in the liturgy, you also have an orderly spiritual life. And what I'm harping on is what Anthony discovered was that in order to live in community, one needed to have a rule that one followed. Now, I know we don't like the word rule anymore, so just call it a pattern for living, if that helps you feel better about it. Whether you call it a rule or a pattern doesn't matter. What counts is that you commit yourself to doing it and that you become obedient to it. Clergy who are ordained, we actually take a vow of obedience, and we make a commitment to live by a particular rule of life. Imperative in the vows of ordination is a commitment to the daily offices, for instance, that we will in fact say the daily offices every day. Now, you know, that's a rule that we commit to. It's also something we strive to live perfectly, which most of us fail miserably at from time to time. But that's not, the failure isn't the point. The point is the effort. And so I would encourage you as vergers to have more conversation when you're together about how we live this life, both in congregations and as a community of vergers. Because that's the other thing, is that this is a community that's part of the wider community, but is also apart from the wider community. That's one of the problems with being called to be a leader. Again, as you look at all the biblical examples of people who are called to be leaders, that while they live within the context of community, there is always a certain kind of apartness in their ministry, going all the way back to Moses and Aaron and the 70 others that were called out. And if you remember, we used those readings, the Numbers reading recently, where Moses had others who were called to help him lead. Even Eldad and Medad, who were smart enough to know it was going to be a problem and tried to get out of it, and worked with it. And so, you know, these models of leadership that run throughout Scripture really apply to us as a community of individuals who have a particular calling, which is to be I'm encouraging you to develop a rule of life that shapes and patterns the spiritual side of your life. That's this, you know, that rule is fairly simple, as I said this morning, going back all the way back to Anthony. That Christians are called to live a life that's a life of prayer, a life of study, and a life of action. And you need all of them in balance. If all you have is prayer and study and you don't do anything about it, you're no better than those Eremitic monks who lived in the desert and just didn't want anybody to bother them so that they could keep at saying their prayers. Prayers without action they help you feel good, but they don't do anything for the church.